This is the ICC one, right? Can I have the exact wording in the motion?
This House would empower the ICC
empower ICC
to use military forces.
To what?
To use military force.
Oh, use military force, okay.
To capture indicted war criminals.
Indicted? Okay,
indicted
fine.
War criminals. Yes.
Huh?
Next time you're up to your point.
Okay, thanks. Guys, I like to smile and nod when I adjudicate. Doesn't mean I agree with you. Just means I like to smile and nod. So don't be like, oh my god, these guys. Hey, like to call us house to order. Welcome to round 5. Congrats both teams on making this far. Perhaps you will break by now. Without any further ado, now I'd like to welcome the Prime Minister to begin. This week. Here. Oh, wait. Just don't mind it. Okay. There you go.
Alright. So the model we're going to bring to you from the side proposition is fairly clear. We're going to give the ICC small task forces, small covert forces, to quickly extradite the people, the war criminals, and then bring them to the ICC where they can get tried. We're not going to give these covert forces or the task forces the power to invade, or the power to create wars, or the power to create massive conflicts, but only to extradite quickly, cleanly, and easily with as little casualties as possible. We're also going to train them with expertise and know-how in whatever necessary fields, but we're also going to make sure that these forces are subject to the international laws that already do exist. Therefore, they're not going to be able to just run wild with anything, but they still have to follow the due procedure. So I'm going to first talk to you about why should the ICC have this power and not the nation capture them, and then afterwards I'm going to talk to you about why this is going to be beneficial for getting justice firstly, secondly reducing the amount of war crimes that actually occur, and thirdly I'm going to also mention domestic courts and why they're not enough. So firstly, why should the ICC be the actor and not the nations, or even the UN or NATO? We think that these nations are subject to political pressure, and we need to understand that these nations have many things to consider. For example, the backlash that they could get if they fail, or if they have casualties during that mission, as in what happened during the US and the Somalian example. Moreover, they also have IR implications that they have to consider. If there is an arms deal that is going on between the US and Iran, the US aren't going to be willing to go into Iran just to indict one of their war criminals. Moreover, we don't necessarily think that these politicians are going to be in a position where they're going to be willing to risk their job, which is going to come under pressure if they fail and if these inconveniences occur, only to capture this one war criminal. In comparison to that, we think the ICC are far more independent as an actor in our society. They don't necessarily have any voters, they don't necessarily have IR implications to consider, they don't necessarily have backlash to consider. Their job in our society is to try these war criminals for justice, the war criminals who have committed massive amounts of murder or who have committed atrocious crimes which we think need to be punished. Why can we not do that in the status quo then? The problem is because the ICC does not have the power to meaningfully get these people into the courthouse in the first place. Indictments mean nothing at all unless they can meaningfully affect these war criminals in the first place. That means that in the status quo you cannot actually prosecute them, which simply means there is no justice guaranteed. And we don't think that justice can be achieved in any situation unless these people are actually punished for the crimes that they have made. Therefore, there is a unique need to capture these war criminals in the first place, and when the nation are not capable of doing so, then we think that the ICC needs to have this power in order to fulfill the role of ICC in the first place in our society. No, thank you. We need to understand that if we are to take this proposal, the individual war criminals or potential war criminals are going to be far more reluctant to commit these war crimes in the future. Because after our proposal, these task forces could show up any time and take them away into the ICC. That's going to be a far better situation compared to the status quo, where these criminals are not scared of anything, do not fear anything, because they know that the ICC does not have any power to take them in. Moreover, we think we're going to see an increase in cases where the war criminals are likely, or the potential war criminals are likely to agree peacefully to come to these come to the ICC, because at the end of the day, even after at the end of the day, under our paradigm, they're going to be captured anyways. Therefore, if they have an incentive to clear their name, then we think under our paradigm, we can have that trial, and then we know the outcome of that trial. The problem with the status quo is, even if these people are innocent, they won't even bother to come, because they know that there is no necessity to even try to clear their name, because it's not going to have any effect on them as a person. Yes?
In the status quo, countries enter into the ICC voluntarily. Under your paradigm, they're never going to enter into the ICC in the first place.
Thank you. And that's one argument which I have two pre-rebuttals ready to answer you. So they're thinking that if we do this, we're going to have lots of countries fly away from the ICC, and ICC is going to be not meaningful. The problem is, the ICC is already unmeaningful because they do not have the capability to convict. If they do not have the capability to convict and actually get justice at the end of the day, the outcome under their paradigm is the same as what's happening in the status quo, where we cannot even get these people to come to the court in the first place. But moreover, we need to understand who the war criminals actually are. They're not necessarily the ones who have the power to create the policies within that nation. They're not necessarily the ones who have the power to decide whether that nation pulls out of the ICC in the first place. A case in point, General Fonseca, who was the leader of the Sri Lankan government during the Inland War, when he committed war crimes against the liberation of Tamil Tigers, then that person doesn't necessarily have that power as a general in the military to pull Sri Lanka completely out of the ICC in the first place, so that harm doesn't exist. The second thing that we think that they come up and talk about is about sovereignty and the rights of these nations and why it's wrong to simply intervene. In these instances, we need to consider the crimes that they're actually committing. War crimes are crimes which we think are crimes against humanity. And what this means is that it's not just a crime against the victim in itself, but it's a crime against the idea of humanity in itself, a crime that's done against the human beings in itself. Therefore, we think that in these instances, these people, or these nations of these countries, of these war criminals, do not necessarily have the right to say they still have sovereignty. It's the same instance with genocide. When genocides occur, we are happy to go in and stop genocide, and that's admitted under the status quo, to intervene into sovereign nations and to stop the genocide. That's because that's also a crime against humanity, and we believe that if a crime occurs which is against the principal ideas of humanity in the first place, then it's okay to intervene in sovereignty. The final argument about why domestic courts are not enough. Firstly, we think that domestic courts do not necessarily have enough capability to be able to try these nations. Why is that? We think that war criminals in the first place have, to an extent, an army under their base which they can control, and in the context of these nations which are probably developing or conflict-ridden areas, then these states don't necessarily have the same amount of power, or even if they had, they're not willing to risk the conflict to just simply arrest this one person. Therefore, you have a situation where you cannot arrest it. But moreover, these war criminals have political support of groups of people within the nation that the state has to consider about. Therefore, even if they are tried under the domestic court, they are only given amnesty within that nation, and that's another reason why these war criminals don't necessarily fear the outcome. That's another reason why justice is achieved, because you're not actually trying the criminal for what that person did, but you're trying that criminal considering the outcome of that, of doing that, of arresting them. Yeah, sorry. So that's why, in comparison to that, we think the ICC needs to be able to make these compromises, doesn't need to make these compromises, and can act for justice, and for those reasons, we think we need to take this proposal.
Okay, thank you. Thanks to PM, and I'd like to welcome Liang. Thank you. Here.
In today's debate is that ICC is not a super government that automatically has jurisdiction in countries. ICC has legitimacy and jurisdiction in certain areas because the governments of those countries agree to give ICC certain power within those regions. And that means that if countries start denying the legitimacy of ICC and say, we say that we're not going to be a part of the ICC, what's going to happen is that the ICC will not be able to send armies into those countries, no matter how effective their task force might be, right? We see that this legitimacy and this jurisdiction are going to be significantly harmed and reduced under their model, because there will be local backlashes about the idea of a military intervention. But with that coming further from my substantiation, let's first look at their model. They talk about a small task force bringing as little casualty as possible. Ladies and gentlemen, let's look at who ICC prosecutes. ICC doesn't prosecute somebody who hides in his own house alone, right? We're talking about these people who commit mass genocide, who, quote, have military under their own power, according to the Prime Minister. So what we're talking about is not a small task force about a size of a dozen of people. We're talking about hundreds and thousands of the people to get through the military that the PM talked about in order to get that one person who's in power. We say that their idea about small task force is extremely ideal and naive about the nature of the criminals that we have to pursue, that we try to pursue through ICC trials. We also see that this gives the government excuses to bring backlashes about ICC. For example, to pull out of the agreements to be a part of ICC, to militarize themselves further to protect their power, right? Well, this leads very smoothly to their idea about potential war criminals. They said that war criminals now know that they're going to be caught, so they're going to just turn themselves in to ICC. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not what happens in the reality. If I committed a crime and I know I'll be punished by ICC, what I try to do is fight as much as possible until I'm caught and punished. I don't simply go, now they have task force of 100 people. Let me turn myself in. What I do is build an army of 1,000 people so I don't get caught by ICC. They do not understand the nature of the criminals that ICCs pursue. That's why their policy is extremely naive and extremely dysfunctional, right? We also see that ICC as an actor is not necessarily the best argument on the table, because as I've told you, ICC doesn't have automatic jurisdiction. If they make policies that brings backlashes from the government, ICC as a whole loses jurisdiction, not only on war criminals, but any and all kinds of other criminal offenses that they want to prosecute. Less number of countries signed it means more number of countries that criminals can run into and find safety for themselves. And they already quoted ICC is already unmeaningful. If ICC is already unmeaningful, the last thing we should do is give them more power, such as military power. And lastly, they also talked about how the people that they're trying to pursue is not necessarily policymaker. One, we say that, in fact, many of these cases, they are the policymakers, or at least they're the regional big powers. It's very difficult to get rid of these people without the local backlashes, like the power vacuum that my partner will further talk about. Now let's move on to substantives of my argument. First of all, I'm going to talk about national sovereignty, which they so conveniently try to brush off through some preemptive matters. After that, I'm going to talk about the consequences, including ICC losing the legitimacy, and then talking about the militarization. No, thank you, sir. Now let me move on to the national sovereignty point. Yes, national sovereignty. We say that national sovereignty, yes, can sometimes be mitigated or yielded to international power if there are direct, overt harms, such as crimes against humanity. We do agree that sometimes we let UN come in and take certain and make certain actions, but we do not allow UN to come in and take away the leader who's in power. We do not let UN come in and kill people. The only things we allow them to do is peacekeeping. And we say peacekeeping and active removal of people in places are two completely different things, especially because ICC is mostly controlled by developed Western countries. For example, if you look at the statistics of what kind of criminals and what nationalities of criminals are persecuted or are pursued by ICC, we see that there's a great imbalance in the number of, say, European or Western criminals versus African criminals, right? We see that ICC is already controlled by these big countries. And even if they have a task force, and even if we somehow assume that ICC can be fair, they can never, ever send their military into places like United States, into places like China, because they do see that there's a great, big international relations backlashes coming from these big powers. So all they can do with their task forces or militaries is bully the weaker countries that does not have the power to speak back through the international policies. We say that this is extremely bad because this now gives legitimacy for the Western, big, strong, developed countries to send military, physical powers into these places to stop the leaders of the countries, especially since, as they said, developing countries are always ridden over by certain things. Now they have the legitimacy to send task forces, military into those places, take out the leaders that do not agree with the Western government. We say that this takes away the power of self-determination from the people. The local governments will now prioritize the interests of the Western governments rather than the interests of the people whom they need to think about, right? Now let's talk about lose legitimacy. I talked mostly about this already through my rebuttals. We say that losing legitimacy is extremely important because now it makes it extremely difficult to catch other types of criminals as well. And now when ICC loses the legitimacy in these things, we lose a big organization that is basically the only organization that has a say in these kind of humanitarian crimes, right? We also see that because these countries already have resentment about the racism that I talked about, they're especially likely to pull out, and authoritarian regimes, especially in Africa, will now have an excuse to pull out, excuse to propaganda about these things, excuse to pull out. And militarization, I have already talked about in my rebuttal as well. For these reasons, ladies and gentlemen, their policy will only bring negative effects. Thank you.
"7 minutes, and not a single piece of analysis about how under their paradigm the ICC will be able to prosecute war criminals. They gave us no mechanism through which, under the status quo, the ICC is able to arrest war criminals and try them for their crimes. They gave us no mechanism through which these people would ever submit to this kind of tribunal. We think that if on their side they cannot show that even a single war criminal will be prosecuted, they probably can't win a debate about the ICC, unfortunately for them. So let's start with a little bit of rebuttal. So they came up and they reiterated their point of information instead, right? They said countries will withdraw from the ICC, and if they do that, the ICC won't even be able to send in a task force because they won't have the legitimacy. The thing is, that's the same as under the status quo, because if the ICC can't arrest these people, they can't be tried. So even if, after giving the ICC power, some countries withdraw, it's the same outcome as under the status quo, because under the status quo, we can't arrest those people anyways, right? So there's no difference. But what Yuki told you is that this will allow us to arrest many other kinds of war criminals, right? Because lots of war criminals do not have the decision-making power within their countries. Countries that are fragmented within different sorts of rebel groups. And say some rebel groups are using child soldiers, or using rape as a tactic of war, or burning villages to the ground. These people don't have decision-making in their countries, but those domestic countries also don't have the capability to arrest these people. Now, if we give the ICC the ability to arrest them, like this country won't withdraw, because actually these people may be the enemy of the dominant government, but we will be able to try them for their crimes and bring them to justice, which is a very tangible benefit on our side of the house. Then they try to say, well now all these countries will withdraw from the ICC. Okay. We don't think many countries will do that, because what that says is we might be war criminals in the future, right? Like, withdrawing from the ICC because they might prosecute war criminals says, like, well, we think there's a reasonable chance we'll be war criminals in the future, so we should withdraw from the ICC. But we say that's not a message many countries want to send, and also, like, most leaders of most countries don't plan on becoming war criminals. right? If anything, they're worried about the sort of like maybe jihadists or other sort of very threatening like minor groups within their countries committing war crimes like within that state and being unable to stop them. So we actually think they might welcome the ICC having this increased amount of power. Then they try to say, well, the UN doesn't do this, well, therefore we can never do it, right? No analysis about what the UN is, what it should do, or why this might be a good thing. First of all, we think it's a tragedy that the UN never had its own individual military. That's cited as being the reason why the UN became an ineffective organization, because it did not have the individual power to uphold international norms. That meant it had to rely on the developed countries to provide the military, which is the reason why these international institutions are under the thumb of developed countries. What we say is when you give these organizations autonomy, they're no longer beholden to the power influence of developed countries, right? Because like the people on the Security Council, or because the soldiers themselves are provided by developed countries' militaries, it means that the UN is dependent on like what these countries want, right? But if we made them autonomous, then they would be able to intervene much more readily in genocide, which, as Yuki told you again, is something that these countries may not want to do because of political implications, which was the case with Somalia. So we think that, going on to the point about sovereignty, we think that very clearly, when you commit a crime against humanity, you have violated any claim you have to the protections of sovereignty, because you have committed a crime against humanity itself. This is the same reason why if you commit murder, like, you can be tried later on. We don't just arrest people in the act of committing murder, we punish them after the fact for committing murder, because that is in the interests of justice. Under their, like, paradigm, like, well, you know, why arrest someone after they committed murder? The murder's already done, like, there's not even any benefit. Like, punishing someone for doing something horrible is a benefit in the demands of justice, but moreover, it creates an incentive not to do these things in the future, because you might be arrested, tried, and sentenced to death or something, right? So it means that it prevents future war crimes, prevents future crimes against humanity, which is a very tangible benefit for arresting these people. Yes?
You characterize those criminals as people who are not in power. If one person in Korea commits a crime, does it mean that Korea as a nation loses its sovereignty?
It does, but it's a crime against humanity, and Korea is unwilling or incapable to prosecute, right? That's a definition of crime against humanity. That's why when you commit genocide, you lose your right to sovereignty, right? That's the very definition of crime against humanity, and you guys need to, like, properly understand this. Like, that's another reason why I say we can extradite people from certain countries if they're not willing to prosecute, right? Or we can, I mean, that's the reason why we prosecuted, like, Slobodan Milosevic, right? Even though he was, like, you know, a citizen of Slovenia or whatever, we were still justified in prosecuting him on the international stage because of what he had done. The same reason why we were justified in prosecuting the Nazis. Even though the Nazis were Germans, we were perfectly justified in prosecuting them on an international stage because they committed crime against humanity as a whole, not just crimes against Germans. It's a completely consistent point. Finally, they try to tell us that, like, well, they're only going to arrest criminals in developing countries. They're not going to arrest criminals in developed countries, and this is, like, really unfair, blah, 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 blah. First of all, we say, if we arrested some war criminals rather than no war criminals, that's a win, right? That's a good thing. Like, under their model, we arrest no war criminals. Even if under our model, we only arrest war criminals from developing countries, that's still, like, a good thing to have done. But moreover, we think once you make these institutions autonomous, they're no longer beholden to the powers of these developed countries, right? It's exactly because they rely on developed countries for their resources, and especially for their funding, like their military, like, people, like with the UN, right? But they have no power to arbitrate over these developed countries, right? But when we make them autonomous, they actually have more power relative to these developed countries, which means it's more likely that they're able to put influence over developed countries. Also, like, we don't think, like, say in the United States of America, there was someone who, I don't know, like, committed a local genocide or something or recruited child soldiers. We don't think the United States of America has an interest in protecting that person from international law. Like, we don't know what world they're living in. You know, if there's war criminals running around in developed countries, we don't think developed countries are like, no, don't take our war criminals. You know, we want to protect our war criminals. Like, we don't know, like, what universe they're living in. So what have we shown you today? We've shown you that under their model, they can arrest 0 war criminals. Pretty unfortunate for them. That one, this actually empowers these international organizations by making them autonomous, by decoupling them from the influence and power of developed countries, that it is principled and that it is in the interest of justice that we do this. And for all those reasons, we are very, very, very proud to propose. Thank you.
to welcome the DOO to continue the opposition.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, today the government painted us a very delightful picture of how they can actually somehow sneak into the house of those human rights criminals and somehow get away with their bodyguards and get away with all their political and economic influence and relations in their countries and catch them clean and neat, quoted their words. However, even if they brought it up in their model of their Prime Minister's speech, they're never going to tell us how this kind of neat and clean, this kind of working process will actually be enforced. They never tell us this mechanism. However, on the other side, interestingly, they accuse us of offering no mechanism to catch any criminals. There are few responses to that. First of all, today it is never the opposition's burden to show you another countermodel. And then second of all, we see that under the status quo, the reason why we somehow may not catch many war criminals is for the very simple reason that this kind of crimes is not committed on a daily basis. We do not see that there are many war criminals, no, thank you, catching every day. And we see that how we are going to solve this problem. Actually, we see ICC, it may not be very effective under the status quo. However, we see that in order to solve this problem, we should actually sort to those international relations negotiations. For example, we should try to let China and US sign to become a signatory country, and therefore this kind of law enforcement can better enforce in those countries. And actually, they also accuse us that we offer no incentive for the war criminals to show themselves to the court. However, it is not true. Our speaker has already constantly told you that because the threat that under status quo offered is not very immediate and it's not violent, these war criminals, they does have the incentive to improve the situation in their own country. And before I go on to my substantive of talking about how their somehow very bizarre and obscure mission is never going to fulfill, let me first talk about the three mischaracterizations they have today. First of all, they characterize the ICC as somehow a very independent court without any influence of the political regime or whatsoever. However, we see that it is not true. First of all, ICC is not a domestic court. Therefore, its jurisdiction can only extend to those countries who are the signatory countries. And our first speaker has already told you that China and US is not a signatory country to this organization. We see that they are two of the countries in the State Security Council. We see how important it is, and we also see the very scary human rights record in China. Even this country is not in the signatory power, so we see that ICC cannot extend its jurisdiction to those countries. And no, thank you. And somehow they brought the idea that ICC is already enforced. So therefore, it is a kind of one-way contract. These countries already the signatory countries, they will never pull out. However, we see that it is not the case, and our Prime Minister has already constantly shown you. The second mischaracterization they about is the war criminals. They say that these war criminals may not necessarily have the power to somehow influence the country. However, they accuse us of not correctly understanding the operation of the ICC. However, we tell you that what kind of crimes that the ICC actually dealt with. It is the genocide, the war crime, and crime against humanity. We do not believe that a random person on the street can commit such a crime. So this kind of person must have very strong influence in those countries with all the political and economic ties and so on and so on. Before I go on, yes please.
Given that the United States was able to, with 12 Navy SEALs, arrest Osama bin Laden in the middle of a Pakistani military compound, don't you think that it's reasonable that our task squads can arrest people in other similarly like places?
We see that it is not true because ICC, they also requires negotiation, for example, of military from many other countries who will not effectively control this kind of task. And second of all, we see the terrorist, he is actually hiding in some remote place. It is unlike the war criminals we are talking about, who actually control the countries, who actually has lots of bodyguards, who actually has lots of political ties and economic influence in that soil. So their accusation is simply not true. Their example is irrelevant. And I'll go on to make a substantive to tell you why they somehow obscure mission, even if they can somehow sneak into the house of the dictator and catch them, it's not going to work for the following reasons. The first of all is we first have to categorize what kind of person that this dictator is. They somehow in their own countries, in their own soil, they actually can enjoy a large support base and actually has a very strong political powers and economic relations in those countries. It is not easy task for us to eradicate them. And second of all, even if we say that we can catch them, it is going to have a very serious power vacuum. For example, we see that in places like Uganda, we see like in the place like Tanzania, and so